Hi, you're listening to the Fullstack Educator Podcast.
We provide relevant resources to new and aspiring independent school leaders to help you grow, succeed at work, and have a positive impact on the lives of students.
I'm Michael.
And I'm Matt.
On this podcast, we have insightful conversations with leaders from across all areas of independent school education. Matt, how's it going?
It's going fine. How are you, Michael?
I'm doing well. So, season 2 of the Fullstack Educator Podcast. Did you think that this would be a thing?
I had my doubts. But here we are. Season 1 was a lot of fun. We had some really great stuff. It, of course, like everything last year, it ended not the way we anticipated it was going to end. But I still go back to the content and look at it. I mean, it was really, I learned a lot. So I'm looking forward to an equally good season this year.
Absolutely. Yeah, I feel the same way. I learned a whole lot. And I've been surprised, it was an experiment to begin with. We weren't sure what was going to happen.
Right.
But I've been surprised, some of the episodes, a couple in particular, are still downloaded many times a week still, which is pretty cool.
Fantastic.
Especially our first episode with Lawrence Alexander, that still is downloaded on an almost, maybe not daily, but weekly basis. So we had some good stuff. I learned a lot from that one. So it's been quite a year, quite a few months since we ended the last season. The pandemic had already occurred, and there was a lot of social unrest, the protests, a whole lot of stuff happening in politics,
right.
And so that's impacted schools a lot, and it's impacted us. How has the pandemic specifically impacted the work you do in the advancement world?
Well, it was interesting for me because I actually changed jobs during the summer. So I started my new position at the beginning of June, when we were right in the thick of things. Everyone was still sort of debating what's going to happen in the fall, and I do fundraising. So I think the thing that stood out for me, I had the benefit of not really having to worry about programming. That's just not on my plate, but my job is very relational. And so just trying to get to know people. Normally you would start out with a lot of asking folks out to lunch or coffees just to get to know folks, and either donors or just, former students, current parents, all of that stuff. None of that could happen. So, but at the same time, while we couldn't do a lot of face-to-face, I did find people, as the summer went on, people were pretty eager for a phone call. There would, you'd have, of course you have folks who are busy, but you have other folks that yeah, please, anything. I'll talk to you for 2 hours straight. So that was kind of nice. There was an eagerness and a little bit of an availability. I have started having a couple of lunches and coffees as people feel comfortable and we can do it in the right way. And I did have one friend and donor say that he has slowed down from 5th gear and that he's not going back, even after the pandemic. And I thought that's good. I mean, if there is a silver lining, at least in my world, things have slowed down, not necessarily in a bad way. What about you? Yeah,
well, so I am in academics. I'm the director of STEAM programs at an international boarding school. So boarding school, man, that was a whole lot to think about once the pandemic hit. But the school I'm at had, we got on the ball really early, and it's really been a great experience, very educational to be on the team at the school I'm at. Just figuring out what does it look like to safely try to open a boarding school. And it turns out that for boarding schools, opening safely was maybe a little bit easier because we have a contained environment. So there was a whole lot of work up front, but we ended up being able to open in a way that we think is safe, and
good.
Had to educate faculty, a whole lot of professional development happening really quickly, kind of, trying to figure out what the best tools are and get the tools. There was a little while there where, you get online and everything associated with teaching, like all the technology for teaching online was, sold out for a little while. So some concerns about some supply chains, but
sure.
But we opened and we've been going for 8 weeks and it's been phenomenal. It's gone great. I've really been grateful for the team we have here, but figuring out how to teach in such a different setting has been definitely a challenge. I don't know that I can relate with the going down from fifth gear yet, but I hope to get there.
Yeah, that may have not been what our listeners wanted to hear.
Yes, that does sound pleasant. For educators, I feel like maybe that's not what happened. But yeah. So what's our episode today about?
Yeah, so we've got an interview with my good friend, Julie Ray. She's going to talk to us a lot about how school finance works, what the business office does, what all of those people behind the business office door are actually doing all day long, and just offer some great tips on how to interact. So a lot to learn from her.
Awesome. Well, let's get to it.
All right. Our conversation today is with Julie Ray. She is the Chief Financial Officer for Mount Paran Christian School, leading the administrative services, which includes the business office, the human resources department, information technology, and operations facilities departments. Julie received her bachelor's degree in liberal arts from the University of Texas at Austin and her master's degree in business administration from George Mason University, with a focus on management and interest in organizational design and development. Julie's been with Mount Paran Christian School since 2003 and her current role since 2006. For a period of 8 years, Julie served as a board member and was the board chair of MISBO, an association of independent school professionals serving the business office, human resources, IT, and facilities. Hi, Julie. We're glad to have you with us. How are you?
Thank you. I'm doing great. It's a beautiful morning. I look forward to our talk.
Yes, we do too. So why don't you start out by telling us a bit about yourself and your experience in independent schools?
Right. All right. So if I go way back, I was a military brat. My dad was in the Air Force. We moved around a lot. I lived overseas most of my last half of my childhood. So I was in Japan for 3 years, Germany for 5. Went to undergrad in Texas and got my MBA at George Mason University in the DC area. And I went into international data communications industry. So I'm not a CPA, I'm an MBA. And so it does make a difference. It's not always typical for business officers in independent schools, but actually at Mount Paran, I was a mom first. And then in 2006, in December, kind of mid-year in a school year, I was asked to step into the business office role. There was an unexpected change of my predecessor. So kind of a different path than the average business officer of an independent school, but it's worked for me.
No, that's good to hear. I think, one of the great things about independent schools is you can do a variety of things and people take different paths sometimes. Now, you were also for a time on the board of MISBO. Is that correct?
That's true. And I am a card-carrying, I bleed MISBO colors member. I absolutely believe in MISBO. So when I started, I was actually working in our preschool, just helping the front office there because I had a little one in preschool. And I did a bunch of things serving some different board committees and things like that. And so when I was asked by the head of school to step into the role, I was walking in having had no independent school administration experience before other than just what I had experienced in the preschool. So I turned to MISBO and peers through MISBO, mentors, people who are very experienced were on my speed dial. And I met them in conferences. I went to every workshop I could go to. I spent a lot of time chasing people down, asking questions, and I received an incredible education from them. It kind of shortcut the learning curve, and it helped me get to solutions very quickly, practical things I could do right away, solutions, and learn my way through it. So I really rode on the shoulders of others. And because of that, I feel like it's very strong to have that collegiality where you have business officers in communication on a regular basis, because when one is going through something, another might not be going through it at that same time, but a year and a half later, they may need to call you and say, okay, I know you've done this. Talk to me about it. And so MISBO has been incredible for me from professional development standpoint, friendship standpoint, networking, really strong.
Can you tell us about the, and for those who may not know, I always get the acronym wrong. It's the Mid-South Independent School Business Officers Association. Is that right?
Yeah, that was the original acronym. They eventually did away with it. And so now it's making independent schools beyond the ordinary, moving them beyond the ordinary. So they use all these different things for the acronym now. But
right. Yeah.
That was the original one.
Okay. I like the second one better. That's definitely better. So can you tell us a little bit about the size and scope of MISBO?
Absolutely.
And we'll get into resources a little bit later too, but I think now would be a great chance to talk about that.
Yeah, sure. So MISBO is mostly the southeastern United States. There are a few other schools around the country that are also members. And it's made up of about 340, 350, maybe a little bit more than that now, independent schools with all different kinds of structures, day schools, boarding schools, schools that are religious, schools that are not, a lot of different types of schools, large, small, everything like that.
That sounds like a really cool organization. I actually had not heard of MISBO before this conversation. So this is really great. So Julie, you clearly have a lot of experience with independent school business and finance. I'm curious if you could share just a basic framework for independent school finance for our listeners.
Absolutely. So basic framework goes back to the question of balance. And in the business office, the framework of an independent school is always looking at what income has to come in order to balance the money that has to go out in expenses. And often there are elements of income and expenses that everybody doesn't realize that are not as obvious, all the granular details that are underneath. So the business office is constantly managing that teeter-totter between income and outflow. They're also managing that balance between what we own versus what we owe. So how does debt play into your picture, and how do you keep balance there? When they're thinking through things, the balance involves making decisions about what's most important for the big picture, for the mission of the school. Thinking ahead. So you're anticipating, this is what the mission says, here's what my strategic plan says, here are my goals, what are the options for pulling that off, and what is that going to take? I have to think ahead about equipping those possibilities to take place and allowing the decision to be dynamic as we go down that path. And then beyond that, the business office has to balance everything in the framework of compliance. So we have a lot of regulatory requirements and things like that. So when you're dealing with compliance, the best thing is to think about what is the regulatory requirement trying to get us to do? What is the intent behind that requirement? When you're thinking about it from that perspective, very often what you'll find is that it's very logical. For example, a Form 990 discloses best practices for governance for the board. Yes, it discloses your finances as well, but it shows how do you practice. Well, what are they getting at? Well, they want to see something healthy. They don't want to see a not-for-profit operating in a way that's going to lead to unhealthy practices in the school. And that way they are staying within the expectations of government in terms of having a tax benefit, being a tax-exempt organization. So balance is really the key. It's balancing those critical pieces, income and outflow, what you own versus what you owe, thinking ahead and thinking of the intent of compliance and trying to meet that intent and spirit the best that you can.
I really like the idea of balance. That's a really helpful and simple framework, but it makes a lot of sense. And I like how you laid that out for us. What are some of the essential staff positions and roles in a typical business office?
Great question. So I would say number one, and the most obvious one, is probably your accountant / comptroller type of person. In many independent schools, especially small ones, that is your business officer that's doing that job. In a slightly larger school, you may have a separation of that role so that the person who's managing the general ledger, keeping score on the transactions of the school, may be a separate office. The next positions would be payables, which is paying all the invoices and expenses and reimbursements of the school, versus receivables, which is receiving the tuition, receiving the fundraiser income, receiving ticketing and concession monies, things like that. So typically you want your payables and your receivables as separate people. It's a better check and balance. Typically you don't want to have one set of hands receiving money and turning around and paying it. But the truth is, if you're a smaller independent school, a lot of these functions are going to be in one seat. And so there's some complexity to it, and you just have to build internal controls when that's the case so that more than one person has eyes on what's happening. But those are probably the three most basic roles. What I would add to that for a school that's slightly larger or that's doing a lot of startup work is someone who manages purchasing and bids, who can do requests for proposals, RFPs, and also who can be the one that goes out there and searches out, here's 5 different solutions for what you're asking for. These are the ones that have the best quality and the best price. These are the ones that other schools have said they use well, and gives that option so that you don't have faculty members and department staff members going around and just plucking solutions out of the air without support. They should have research and support. Then finally, overall, your entire business office team really has to have a strong attitude of customer service. How can I help you? What is the need you have? How can I meet that? Is it possible to meet that? Have we gone through all the steps to know that that's the direction we need to go in? Once we know that that's true, then my job is to make it happen. So I would say your basic team framework is kind of built there. One other thing I forgot to mention is often schools will have a human resources person. The smaller schools, again, might have human resources sitting in the seat of the business officer as well, where they're having to cover things like employment contracts. But if you can manage it, it is very wise to have a separate human resources person, somebody who is certified through SHRM, who is keeping up with the Department of Labor and regulatory labor law type things to manage employee relations, to manage the contractual piece of employment, to do orientation, to handle benefits. All those parts and pieces are best with a specialist.
That's great. Something that came to mind as I was hearing you talk about the different roles is it seems like there's a balance between, trying to have enough people to manage all the work, but then also trying to uphold sort of ethical best practices and standards. If you are a smaller school, like you mentioned, and you have to consolidate many roles, what are some of the roles that you just talked about that really shouldn't be consolidated in order to sort of meet the ethical best practices?
That's a good question. I'd say the person who is managing the general ledger should not be handling money coming in or going out. That's just an internal control. If there's a circumstance in which you can't help that, your accountant has to do some invoice payments at times or has to receive money at times, then they should have someone else who is their second. So if I've received money, then I need to go find another person to say, this money has come in. I need you to read it, double check my account, sign that you agree that this is the deposited amount coming in. So I would say the person who is keeping score, your accountant, your comptroller, doesn't want to be mixed in payables or receivables if they can help it. Payables and receivables, as I mentioned before, maybe should remain separate if you can at all manage it. Again, if you can't, then you have to have a second who validates their work. When you do this, it's not insulting to the individual to do it. It is protecting them. You want to protect them from being accused of inappropriate handling. And it's just good fraud management practices. It breeds confidence in the organization's leadership to know that I have more than one set of eyeballs on the transactions to know that they are accurate, that they're timely, that they're being handled properly. So typically, if you have a person who's willing to walk on the wild side, others won't follow them, and you'll be able to detect issues if you have that in your team. The positions that you might be able to consolidate would be like bids and payables. Bids, your bid manager, your purchasing manager, and your payables person kind of shake hands constantly. So that is something that you could put together. Receivables, there's two different kinds of receivables. One is tuition, and the other is other kinds of fundraising, cash, and things that come in. So when you're looking at receivables, it's fine for that to be in one set of hands, but it is helpful at times, since both can be rather busy jobs depending on the size and complexity of your school, for those to be separated as well.
So independent schools are often described as having two sides of the shop. You've got the business and finance side, and then of course you have the academic, the school side. As the CFO, what do you want teachers to know about the business side that is difficult to explain?
That's a good question. I would say that the assumptions going into from a teacher standpoint, looking at the business office, is that it's the no clinic. It's where you hear the word no a lot. And it's not really what it should be, or, what we want it to be. Authentically, an academic person thinks differently than a business person or a technical person does. And that's with good reason. The difference in their roles, the degree of strong skills and empathy that's in a faculty member is something that enhances how a business person might do what they do, but it's not their first skill set. Their first skill set is, organizing and thinking ahead and planning the steps and all that kind of stuff. Not that teachers don't do that. I think they do that phenomenally for lesson planning and things like that. But when it comes to how do I make a trip happen? What are all the legal ramifications of communicating this versus that? How do I plan the finances of it? How do I plan what to charge? How do I manage the dates through the process? I would say that even though we think dramatically differently, walking into the business office is use it as a resource. It's probably the best place to walk in and say, what do I need to be thinking about as I'm preparing this trip? And don't assume that you're on an island by yourself. It's probably been done 15 times before, whatever it is that you're wanting to tackle that's new. There may actually already be a solution somewhere in the school, and the business office can help play that wagon wheel to connect you to that other solution to see if that might work. But don't come in assuming that this is going to be a foreign land and I won't understand anyone. And don't accept it. If jargon gets used, ask, what do you mean by that? What are the implications of that? What if we do this instead? Put your ideas out there. Don't be nervous or uncomfortable. That would be probably my first advice.
Yeah, I think that is great advice. And I like how you pointed out that a teacher shouldn't feel like they're on an island by themselves, which particularly in the upper grades, I think is common amongst teachers. You're kind of the ruler of your classroom, so to speak, and that mentality sometimes carries over where we could really just ask for help from the business office.
Well, so hopefully is glad to provide that. I'm hoping that what that teacher would encounter when they come in is, how can I help you? Because my role is to facilitate, support, equip what you're trying to accomplish. And I may not understand everything about what you're accomplishing, but if I have an idea of how you want to get there, I can help find a way.
That's great. So yeah, you mentioned trips as one sort of point where collaboration happens between the business office and teachers. What are other points where there are common misunderstandings, or what are the things that you have to dispel when teachers come to the business office? I
would say possibly in the areas relating to compliance and risk management and things like that.
Okay.
The things that require informed consent, using a trip as an example, how to communicate up front. Usually, when a teacher is going at communicating with parents and family members, they're saying, hey, we're going to go to this location. We're going to see these things. We're going to learn this. And these are the dates, and I need you to sign your permission. The business office is going to ask them to spell it out a little bit more and say, here's how you can be equipped when you come. Here are the things your child might encounter that, I want to make sure you as the parent know about in advance when they come home and talk about it at dinner. And here's how we're going to handle the unusual little logistics like the safety and transportation, the safety when we stop and eat a meal, how we're going to handle supervision. If it's an overnight trip, how we're going to handle the rooming and the chaperones and things like that. So I'm trying to think of what would be something that they would have a misunderstanding about. I don't think it's really a misunderstanding. I think it's just added layers that they don't normally have to think through.
Okay. Yeah. No, that's fair. I think you've got a good, and I'm sure this carries over into your employees in your office, but you have a servant heart about the business office, that you're there to serve the teachers, which is good. It can be intimidating for teachers to ask for help from the business office.
I don't know if it's a misunderstanding, but something I've observed as a disconnect between business office and faculty are around wanting to do fundraising projects with their classes for different events or perceived needs in the classroom. Do you have any advice or best practices for handling situations where a faculty member comes in and says, hey, we want to do a pizza fundraiser, or we want to wash cars in the parking lot to raise money for, a new microscope or something. What advice do you have around that kind of thing?
That is an excellent question. And I'm glad you brought that up. I didn't think of that before. The truth is that happens quite a bit, actually. And there is the notion that they don't have enough money. And so they're trying to come up with the funds to do what they want to do. And that comes from possibly some past experience where they had extremely limited budget, or where they were encouraged to come up with funds. What we typically do in communicating with teachers in that situation is to say, we don't really need lemonade stand fundraising for the classroom, because we allocate budget through the division to take care of all of your needs. We don't want you to have to worry about coming up with the money. We'll worry about coming up with the money, and we'll channel it to you for what you need. Work with your area administrator. If they agree that whatever it is that you would like to have used that money to do is something that really needs to happen in your classroom, then we'll make sure that you have the money to do it. The other thing to consider is that when we have a lot of little fundraiser, eventually parents will become weary of the fundraising and the asks. And when you're in an independent school, and let's say that your tuition is, $20-something thousand, fundraising for things like tissue boxes and wish list items on the board at the beginning of the year, if I'm paying $20,000 and I'm a parent, I reasonably expect you to have Band-Aids and tissues. So those are kinds of things that we want to try to find solutions through the channels that already exist through budget, and make sure that you have what you need to do what you need to do when you need to do it, without you having to take on a whole company and business by yourself and compete with annual fund or capital campaign goals or other objectives of the school.
That makes so much sense. That's really helpful. And I like that. I appreciate that perspective. Julie, what resources or starting points would you recommend to an aspiring school leader who wants to expand their knowledge of school finance and budgeting and the things that happen in a business office?
Awesome. That's a great question. I would say first and foremost, meet with your chief financial officer, your business officer. Spend some time with them. Ask them to, give me the 10-minute overview of what you do. And then dive in with questions, and don't let jargon get in your way. Ask those questions. Ask them to explain what they mean by certain terminology. Ask them how they decide things. I think that's one of the most important things a person can do that's considering moving into administration or leadership for an independent school, is to get a feel for how do you think your way on this side of the house. And I think also talking through big picture of how do you see the business office fulfilling mission? How do you see these different functions? What are the functions doing that help us reach the goals that we're after? The other thing the person might do, and this is going to sound a little weird, is ask to look at the audit report. It's written in English. You should be able to read it front to back and ask the business officer to say, okay, now tell me what this report means. What is this page all about? What is the income statement telling me? Why the income statement separate from a balance sheet? And allow that person to kind of walk through, here's the critical information you would pull off of this. It's not a bad way to start. It may be kind of more technical, maybe a step 2 or step 3, but I would start with that critical conversation.
Wonderful. That's wonderful. That's really good advice. So in independent schools, I think we probably all know a few people who, started in the classroom and were internally promoted, and then all of a sudden they're in charge of 6-figure budgets or larger. What would you recommend for a leader who has been recently promoted, who needs to learn on the job pretty quickly and has a lot of money that they need to manage?
I actually, this happens every year, so I run into this quite a bit. I would say that first and foremost, it's best to come in with the budget and sit down and say, walk me through why the budget is structured the way that it is. Get familiar with what are the different budget codes and why would I code something to office supplies versus instructional materials, that kind of thing, for people to understand. And to get a big picture of how is the budget developed? How do you receive input from me for my department that I've been promoted and I'm learning this for the first time? How do you get input from me in setting budget? How do I work with you when I need to put transactions in? So to come in with the basic how-to that uses the budget as a launch pad is probably the best first conversation for that person who finds themselves swimming around in that pool. The other thing that would be helpful is to, ask advice. If you were in my position for my department, what would you recommend? You know what's happened transactionally in the past. You know where we're going in the future. What would you recommend that I do with these different aspects of budget? I'm thinking about this or that. What do you think? You don't have to go with the gospel of every single thing the business person says, but they may have some ideas for you, or they may know some tidbits and details that you don't know from the past. It's also good to ask them for best and worst stories and to get some of the principles. If you were in my shoes, what would you say is the critical decision point when you're trying to decide between two possible initiatives for your department? They feel equal. They feel both reasonably important. How do I pick between the two? And get some of those principles from the business officer. Beyond that, I would say, how do I track things? How do I keep track of where I am? Am I going to receive reports from you? Do I need to keep track of it? And then finally, as I'm prioritizing through the year, what are the critical time frame points during the year that I need to look at the budget and say, I need to switch gears. I need to slow something down or speed something up. And I'd say that conversation can be an hour, hour and a half with the business officer. It's a great way to get started.
Yeah, the idea of having a sit down with the business officer and asking these kind of questions is just fantastic. I'm curious, it makes me wonder, do you have any advice for a new business officer who is about to be in a situation where people may be asking those kinds of questions? How would they think about prepping to be able to have those kinds of meetings effectively?
I would say if they know the meeting is coming up, to go ahead and pull that budget in advance, to sit down with that person and be prepared to explain in terms that are not bureaucratic terms, that are not, again, jargonized terms, that they should be prepared to say, what are the typical transactions in that department? I know what they are because I've seen it coming through the general ledger. I know the kinds of things they tend to do. So I can use those examples that person is going to be able to relate to and anticipate, okay, when you receive invoices to pay for the costumes that you've bought for the show, you're going to submit it in this form. It's going to go to this person. And here's where you're going to find your budget code in your budget. This is an example of how your budget works and how you might use this report that has all the codes on it. I think when the business officer is able to try to put themselves in the shoes of the person who does not do what they do every day, and they learn to communicate in layman's terms, in normal day-to-day walking around logic, they're going to be much more successful with the academic team. What they have to understand and recognize is that person was put into that position for a reason. Someone believes in them. They believe in their vision. They believe in what they are going to bring to that department. And my job is to help them be as successful as possible and to help them not develop habits up front that they're going to have to undo later when it comes to the business side.
So I just asked you a question, that assumed a person was internally promoted and then was in charge of a large budget. And part of the underlying assumption of, that question is that generalists over, specialists in schools seem to tend to get promoted. And so let me ask sort of the opposite question. Let's say that someone's kind of a generalist in an organization and they get promoted and they're now working in a leadership position in the business office. What advice would you give to a generalist who finds themselves managing a team of specialists like bookkeepers and financial experts?
All right. So that's actually a great example of me. I would say, number one, you must hire well. You must hire individuals who are experienced, who really know their task, who are not looking to be told a memorization of steps to do their job, who can think what their function is supposed to be and can adapt. So number one would be hire well. Look for experience, look for a growth mindset, a flexible mindset, one who is both willing to learn as well as to teach, because you're going to learn a lot from this person. Second, you look for them to be a thinker and a doer. So someone who is not afraid to speak up and say, we've been doing it this way for years. I see another way we could do this and either save time, make it more accurate, find a better solution that's going to suit the overall school a little bit better than this. And then somebody who's a doer, somebody who will, without being prompted constantly, go out, research solutions, come back and say, here's 3 ideas. What do you think? Second, after hiring well and looking for all those characteristics in your hire, then you want to consult them. As the business officer, you want to go to that person and say, this is what we're dealing with right now. My thoughts are maybe considering this, or this. You're the expert. This is your area. What would you recommend? How do you see this happening most efficiently for what you do for the school? The third thing is listen to them. Don't have a preconceived notion. Trust what they say. Otherwise, they shouldn't be in the role. Then beyond that, I would check their work to protect them. Say, show me what you're doing. Show me how you're doing it. What is the end result of these reports that you produce or these kind of things? And learn to read them well enough that you say, okay, so that I can keep up and understand what's happening in your area, I would like to see these reports once a month or once a week or however often you produce them, just so that I can keep up with what's going on. If I have questions, I'll come and ask you about them. But this will help keep me informed so you're not having to constantly regurgitate updates to me. And then at that point, you're also protecting them. You're receiving their work. You're being the checks and balances. You're staying abreast of it. And then you can anticipate their needs when you're in a leadership meeting and something comes up that you're like, oh yeah, that's not going to work for payables. We got to figure out a new solution for that. It helps you be aware and anticipate what your team will need from you later.
Okay, so let's switch gears to more industry-wide. There's a lot of diversity amongst independent schools, and I suspect there's a lot of diversity in the nuances of financial models. But what are the common struggles that you have seen independent schools face, or that you anticipate independent schools will be facing?
I would say a few things. One is right now, market volatility. Market volatility is very tough on schools with big endowments who rely on those endowments, but it's also tough on organizations that have big debt, especially if that big debt was established in a market where the interest rates were higher, because big debt affects your annual budget. You're having to pay on that every year. So when you're making strategies, when you're deciding things, when you're looking at your financial models, you have to figure out, what is our risk tolerance for the market? What is our dependence on that? And so that you can say, we're fairly tight. We don't have a lot of wiggle room. So I'm going to go more conservative on my investments, and I'm going to be a little bit closer to home on debt. I'm going to tend toward doing without rather than Uber financing everything. As you walk through it, the ability to prioritize the long term over the short term is going to help guide those decisions. So as you're working, you can say, we need this thing. Well, what are you sacrificing to get that thing right now? And how does it serve the way longer term of the school? Is it something that is a flash in the pan idea, or is it something that you can build on over time? So this is where you're collaborating with other leaders of the school, other department heads, and communicating, how do I choose and allocate dollars to this? But also, as you're figuring out what is our tuition for the year, how do I decide those bigger pictures and make those recommendations to the board finance committee? How do I communicate that to leadership and come to an agreement on that? Because ultimately my goal is to build some kind of margin. I don't know what could happen next year. I will have some unexpected things. I have to have margin to absorb those unexpected things. And if all goes well, and if I planned properly, maybe we have a little surplus at the end. When we do, I put that surplus away. I think part of that process is about the way bigger term goal of enabling transformation. Your school has a mission. It is cast down decades of the future, but your ability to get from here to there means that you have to be able to grow. So whether it's on an every year basis or an every 5-year strategic plan basis or whatever it is, if you don't have some flexibility and some margin and some ability to realize, where am I? Am I on a very tight budget every year, or do I have a little bit of breathing space? Am I very dependent on my endowment, or can I manage without it just in case it has a bad year? I am enabling transformation for the long haul for the school by being conservative in those areas. I won't always win, but I can always lean in that direction for leadership.
Yeah. So just to be clear, when you say market volatility, we're talking about enrollment, fluctuations in enrollment and tuition revenue. Is that right?
That in addition to your actual investments. So both things. So when your unemployment rate, like right now, is extremely high, you do have to worry about your enrollment. You have to worry about whether your value proposition is being communicated in a way that compels people to say, I'm willing to do without a second car in order for my child to attend school there. And whether or not you're in a community that can tolerate significant differences as you grow your program to grow your tuition along with it. But I'm also talking about the interest rates in the market and the finance side of the world where the school's reserves sit, whether those are completely restricted reserves in an endowment or unrestricted.
Right. So if there's school is operating on a reasonable endowment draw, but the market dips, that's going to affect the ability to meet expenses.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So in 2008, 2009, when the finance industry kind of caved in a little bit, you saw lots of organizations that had great big tax-exempt bond debt, which that's just a big word for a special kind of debt for tax-exempt organizations, that had higher interest rates. They had rate swaps that were intended to help keep those interest rates manageable, way above the market, and hurting them in their annual cash flow. And then they had endowment money. So their money was tied up in a permanent endowment and they weren't allowed to dip into the base. So the rules have changed about use of endowment, but you're absolutely right. When it comes to a school with an endowment, you have to be careful about your dependence and how it gets applied to budget.
Yeah. You focused on margin as well. And make sure I understand. We're talking about essentially the difference between revenue and expenses. Revenue beyond expenses would be margin, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It is the difference between what you make and what you spend, and it is often controlled by things like market pricing going up and down, or shifts in strategy during the year that say, we decided not to go ahead and do this at this time. It's not right for the development of that particular program. It's maybe a little too aggressive for right now. So we've saved that money. We're going to redirect it over here. Or we might just save that money. So that's exactly what I meant, the margin there.
Yeah, that's an incredibly difficult thing to plan for the long term with the market volatility. Yeah, that's a great insight. So, all right, we talked about common challenges. What are the common mistakes that you see that may not be cataclysmic, but just common missteps that schools tend to make in financial practices?
I would say not challenging their incumbent vendors. So when you have worked with one company for a very, very long time and you go to workshops or get on webinars or hear listserv banter of your peers talking about new aspects or new standards that are applying to the area that vendor in your school serves, and you're like, this is the first I've heard of this. Why have I not heard of this from my vendor? You want your vendors to be value added, and you also want to make sure their pencils stay very sharp. So we get very comfortable. We like our groove. We like our rut. When we get into something that we feel like, oh, this is working, we don't tend to want to challenge it. But there's a way to professionally and respectfully challenge an incumbent vendor. So that would be one area I would encourage people to say, who have we, not shaken the foundation on in 4 or 5 years? What are the areas that might have grown or changed in the last 4 or 5 years in the world that this vendor might not have kept us up, or that they might have, and all we're doing right now is helping them sharpen their pencil? So that could be one thing. Second thing I would think about are debt strategies. The tendency to want to jump on equipment leases, the tendency to jump into borrowing instead of internally financing. If you have an unrestricted reserve and you are doing a major construction project and you have pledges already planned out and you're getting ready to break ground, the pledge payment schedules and the construction schedule are a little bit different. And you're going to have some of your pledges not quite paid yet by the end of your construction project when you're still needing to pay out those construction invoices. If you have enough unrestricted reserve, you might consider, instead of going for a construction bridge loan, look at your reserves. Is there enough room? And I don't mean use it completely, but is there enough room in there to cover some of those instead of having to go for a bridge loan? Debt ultimately hurts annual cash flow. Annual cash flow is subjected to the local economy, local market, and your enrollment. So if your enrollment goes a little up, goes a little down, that really affects what you can do during the year. And debt is like a great big rock that you can't move in that yearly budget. So I would say be careful about jumping on capital leases and debt that's not absolutely necessary or not the most advantageous way to get money done. And I think probably the last thing on that, well, one of the last things on that is act like what you aspire to be financially, not forgetting where it differs from where you are. In other words, look for the other schools that are a little ahead of you in the game of developing their endowment or developing their one-to-one program years ago, or whatever the next strategy, moving into a hybrid virtual model environment as an alternative through your school. Find out who's ahead of you on that and learn from them. And lean into, invest toward that idea. Don't invest in things that you're then going to have to tear out and replace later. Another point on that is consult experts. Sometimes schools will listen to each other. They'll listen to the sheep, to the herd, before they will consult someone who is an expert in that field. And so tend to balance, yes, I want to hear what others are doing, but common practices are not always best practices. Having an expert feed into your thinking as well and churn that around with your mission and your leadership's conversation is critically important. And finally, I would say a big mistake that business officers very, very often make is they do not make time to get professional development. They think they can't leave their desk. The school will fall in. They're going to get called 14 times a day, that they cannot go to a conference. They can't go to a workshop. They can't listen to a podcast. They can't participate in a webinar. And so they skip it because the urgency of the moment is winning over their long term. This gets back to the question of prioritizing long term over the short term. If they can be careful to protect their professional development, they will make their jobs easier.
That is phenomenal advice. I love all of that, but I particularly love the notion of constantly bidding or at least consistently rebidding contracts, rebidding vendors. And as you said earlier, man, the idea of a dedicated person to do RFPs would be amazing. I wonder if that person wouldn't even pay for themselves in a couple of years just in sales or in discounts.
I will say that mine does. I have a purchasing manager and she more than pays for herself.
Yeah, I believe it. And those vendor relationships are trickier than one might think. One, it is hard to do the research, but you've also got to manage the town and gown, right? Like there's sort of family relationships sometimes with vendors or, local politics and things like that involved. So having somebody that can manage all of that at the same time, that would be huge.
So Julie, as the pandemic situation and for people who are listening to this, maybe in the future, we're recording this on May 1st, 2020. But as the pandemic situation unfolds, many schools are having to suddenly change their business model. What do you feel like we've learned about business continuity and sustainability during this whole situation?
Oh, man, it's a great question. And I think a lot of schools learned this by it hitting them in the face. And probably all of us, because nobody really anticipated, who would have predicted that this once in 100 years event would happen and the way that it has played out and how long it has played out. I would say that one of the most critical things that business officers can do is risk management. So from a business continuity standpoint, what you're doing is you're saying, how do I anticipate potential things that could disrupt our ability to do business? So a tornado, a fire, an active shooter event, a pandemic. So what you have to do is think through what are all the scenarios that could be very disruptive to our business, to our physical campus, to our employees, other things that could affect how you do what you do to fulfill mission every year for your families. And then what you have to do is say, I'm going to gauge what is the probability of that actually happening. Might it be affected by my geography, affected by my local market and the economy? What's the probability of it taking place and actually affecting us? And so you establish some kind of a rating for probability. Then you say, what is the severity of the impact? If that were to happen, in my probability, I think, I've got a 50-50 chance of that happening at some point during my career here, that could come up. Then what is the severity of it? If it did happen, what's the result? And so you build some kind of a rating factor for that, some kind of a number. If you multiply your probability times your severity, you're going to end up with a number that will help you prioritize all of the crises, all of these terrible scenarios that you hope never happen, into what do I tackle first? Because these are all unrelated things. So that helps you to prioritize those. And then you just start working down the list. So from a business continuity standpoint, looking at pandemic, we would have to say, what are the things we need to be able to do? Well, if you have a tornado that touches down on your campus, it's not that different than having snow days or a pandemic. You're having to operate not on your campus for a period of time. So what makes sense in all three of those, what I need to have is some ability to function virtually. So if you're thinking through your scenarios that way, you're going to find that some solutions cover many different scenarios of business interruption, business continuity interruption. And you'll eventually start saying, okay, so it does make sense for me to give a little leeway and budget toward these areas that'll build a foundation, a safety net, a what if, to be put into place in the event that one of these things comes up. It just so happened that in our school, that our infrastructure team leaders had a retreat a few months ago on business continuity, and pandemic was in the top 5. So we had already begun talking through.
That's amazing.
We're a Christian school. That's a God thing. It's unbelievable. And so what happened was the week before, when we knew that there was coronavirus out there in the world, but the week before we actually had to make the decision to close campus and move to virtual working and virtual learning, the whole business office team and all of the technology teams were capable of working from home. They had tested everything at home. They had parallel systems and devices, printers. They knew the check stock and the list of username, logons, and passwords they needed to take with them, all the different things. They were prepared the week before, so that the week of, we were able to focus on faculty, because then it was just all about them. They're the ones carrying out the mission when we get into a home environment. And so using that as an example, business continuity planning feels like unicorns and cotton candy when you're operating in a normal, regular, healthy, day-to-day, wahoo environment. When the calamity hits, however, you need a plan. You need something that says, step 1, we activate this. Step 2, everybody has already been through this training. We're going to do this. Step 3, we deploy the devices that we already invested in because they're already equipped with this certain software, with Zoom or with whatever, to be able to conduct in a remote environment. And a continuity plan says, how quickly can I get back on my feet? My calamity has just happened. How quickly can I get back on my feet? If I'm an airline, taking months to get back on my feet will kill my business. I can't do months. If I'm a school, months kills my business. I can't do months. So I need the ability to turn it around within days. And it's different for every industry. For ours, relationship and bonding is everything. You can have a few snow days off, but you can't go indefinitely without school.
That's fantastic. I love the way you phrase the end. It almost seems like you're thinking about what capabilities do you really need in order to function given almost any scenario. And I think that's a really great way to think about it. I've been, in the last few years, I've been part of a number of different emergency preparedness meetings with different independent schools. And something that always comes to my mind is just thinking about how the things that would be most likely to be most detrimental are the things that if you throw out as a scenario, people look at you like, where did that come from? That's crazy. When would that ever happen? And so it's hard to prepare for all of those things. But if you think about the capabilities that you would need for different outcomes, like being stuck at home, not like you were mentioning for an airline, not being able to operate for a few months, just can't happen. I think that's a really helpful framework.
Well, one thing that comes to mind with this is that when you're bringing up scenarios that are not real right now, you're functioning fine, everything's going fine, and you bring it up in leadership and you say, we need to plan for a pandemic. And they're like, yeah, pandemic hasn't happened in 100 years. And they, there's, eyebrows are being raised in the room. there is a lot of communication that goes along with this to convince the feelings of resistance that will come up and say, that doesn't feel like a real risk to me. That doesn't feel like something that's, imminently going to happen. And so what you have to think about too is there is a difference in business decision making versus the academic side of decision making. An academic professional is very gifted at empathy. They're gifted at getting between somebody's ears in order to help them make the light bulb turn on and to help them make the connection between concepts, to learn things. So their ability to read people, to feel people, to anticipate their enthusiasm about their learning is a gift. That gift means it comes with great big feelings. Feelings can't make financial decisions. However, feelings should absolutely be involved with how you carry things out. If you do not have empathy and consideration and understanding of what does this mean for someone, how should I communicate with them, what is the impact to them going to be, and how can I mitigate that impact if it's negative or boost it if it's positive, you have to have both hands in these decisions. So it's a tough time for somebody to say, hey, I know this isn't real, but we need to plan for it anyway, to convince someone to do it. But once you convince them, then if it happens, they will come around and hug and kiss you and say that you're wonderful.
Yeah. And like you mentioned earlier, a lot of the solutions that you come up with planning for one scenario transition well to other scenarios too. So it's not like it's a wasted moment.
Well, it's interesting too. I mean, the emergency scenario conversations that I've been a part of tend to be about student safety and teacher safety, and they should be. But to then spin that and talk about business continuity, how are we going to stay in business if this happens? How are we going to make ends meet? Is a whole separate challenge, but arguably just as important for the life of the school. We think about our missions and want them to extend for 100 years, but I suppose we have to plan for a 100-year pandemic if that's the case as well.
People don't tend to understand when they're dealing with the pandemic that we don't have a plan.
Right. Well, Julie, this has been a fantastic conversation. We end each of our podcasts with the following 3 questions. What should people be reading? What should people be listening to? And how can folks get in contact with you?
So what should people be reading? That's a great question. I'm going to give you some unusual answers to that, not what you would typically find. A lot of people will say the wonderful, really great leadership books like Good to Great, that kind of book. There's another one, Defining Moments, that's a little bit more recent. Wonderful book, amazing book. But what I'm going to recommend is Do Hard Things. It's a book by the Harris twins. These were teenagers, and this book was written some time ago, probably 12, 15 years ago. Twins. These are young men who actually were homeschooled, but they were talking about the reduced expectations of young people and how do you approach something. And this happens to business officers all the time and to leaders in independent schools. You'll run into something, you're like, I've never seen that before. I've never done that before. I'm intimidated by that. What am I getting myself into? Do hard things. Believe in yourself. Take the initiative. That's a fabulous book. And I would even read it to my kids. I did read it to my kids. Second book I would recommend, the book of Nehemiah. I know not everybody's a Christian, but it's a fabulous leadership and business book in the Bible.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion.
This is a man who had impossible expectations from a human standpoint that he needed to meet. And he had a ridiculous time frame with basically no authority on his own in his original job, and a circumstance that was kind of working against him. And he made that project happen on time, with success, with quality. He handled the communications and the acknowledgments and the celebration of that success, but he also handled some really tough challenges in the middle that would make anybody's eyes cross. It's a great management book. Third book I would say is Growth Mindset. That's the Carol Dweck book. I know everybody's heard that book ad nauseum in the education world, but it is a fantastic book, I think, for business officers and for any who aspire to leadership. You cannot get comfortable in your groove. You have to be willing to flex and learn. So I'd say those are probably my top 3. What should people be listening to? I would say anything and everything you can get your hands on. Listservs, listen to peers, sources and associations that give practical solutions, read articles, be on Twitter. You don't have to do a lot of tweeting, but following people who are thought leaders that will bring different ideas to mind, that will prompt you to ask questions when, it doesn't seem the right typical climate for those questions to be asked. Ponder when it's not a crisis. Ponder before it happens. I would say anything and everything you can get your hands on. You can read it all, hear it all, and then sift through and find what works for you.
Excellent suggestions. How can people get in touch with you?
So I'm happy to get emails from them. I am at jray, J-R-A-Y, at mountparanschool.com. So J-R-A-Y at mtparan.school.com. And that's probably the best way. I'm also on Twitter. And you'd think I'd know my handle right off the top of my head, but I don't. Because mostly I use it to follow others.
We'll track it down and add it in the show notes.
Okay, that sounds great.
Well, Julie, thank you so much for your time. You have excellent insight and wisdom that I think is going to be a huge benefit to a lot of folks. And we really have enjoyed this conversation.
Well, I appreciate your time, and I'm absolutely honored that you asked me to be a part of this. I'm still a little blown away by it.
Thank you for listening to the Fullstack Educator Podcast. We hope that today's conversation helped you grow as an independent school leader. Be sure to check out our show notes for links to resources mentioned in the podcast. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe, rate it, leave a review, and share it with a friend. Episodes of this podcast are released bi-weekly. You can follow and engage with Matt McGee and Michael Amusio on LinkedIn.